in the county housing stock as long as we could. And so there's a 30-year period where that unit needs to remain affordable. Now there's also the concept that, well, what about people who are coming in at this very low income level? Wouldn't they like to move up as other people move up in the housing market? And that's where the equity sharing concept comes from. And what that is that if they sell the house before the 30 years is passed, they can sell it at a market rate, but they will share part of that equity with the county, and that equity will then go back into the Housing Trust Fund so that it can be used for other affordable units, and that's for owner-occupied. There's some discussion about rental occupancy and keeping it for 30 years, and a number of discussions in there on equity sharing. But that's the concept of equity sharing. And some of the nonprofits had said, well, can you include a provision in there that says that we will either do equity sharing the way that we discuss it here, or as per agreements for funding sources. So Cal FHA has particular requirements for equity sharing. Some of the other funding agencies do, and so we put that provision in here so that, you know, if they have a different funder, then we can follow their prescription for how equity sharing happens. And in your packet you got no, you didn't. Oh, okay, never mind. And then the next section is on owner occupied units. It states that for the target income group will pay no more than 35% of their monthly income, and that's generally a funding requirement for the funders, HUD, and some of the federal agencies. It can't be more than 33%, but 35 is acceptable from time to time, depending on the income level. And again, this is more discussion of the 30 years and what happens at the end of the 30 years. Renter-occupied units. Same period of affordability. The selection of renters, again, by a designee who will qualify renters. Once the 30-year period has passed, then it's no longer subject to the chapter of this ordinance. So we're thinking that if someone builds affordable rental housing and they keep it affordable for 30 years, at the end of that time, then it's no longer subject. They could do whatever they want with it at that point, but that's 30 years down the road.
Question in regards to the 30-year reference through the document. Yes. Was that a major item of discussion between the pros and the cons?
It was. It was. It ranged everywhere from wanting 15 years to folks who said 60 years, and this is sort of in the middle between that. And most of the recommendations for the 30 years came from folks who actually do this, RCHDC, CDC. They said, you know, 30 years is long enough to where you actually keep it in your housing stock for a reasonable time. Then you have the equity sharing provision for owners, but for renters, you want to keep it about 30 years. Some of the other housing providers in the regular development community had suggested 50 years because they said if we're building affordable, we want it to stay there as long as we can. And of course, others wanted it a lot less. So this is sort of a middle of the road compromise.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And that renter-occupied units, same discussion we just had. This next section is how to establish the Housing Trust Fund, or what would be required to establish it. Talks about monitoring, annual audits, and that just discusses where the money, say if we do ever have an in lieu fee paid, where will that money go? And you have to have it's a requirement that you have to have a trust fund that you can then put it into. And then as that money builds, then that will be available for affordable projects. This next section is adjustments, modifications, and waivers. And this is basically to to cover some legal requirements. There's some case law about having an option for having it waived at various times, and that's what that section is about. And yeah, it's just standard language for inclusionary housing. And the severability is the same thing, so. If I can answer any more questions. Oh, in the staff report, there's a list of additional incentives that were proposed by certain stakeholders. Staff did not recommend them because we don't know what the fiscal impacts could be of some of them. Some of them could have extensive fiscal impacts, and it's in your last page of the staff report. There's a little chart that has 3 of them there. Now, we're not suggesting that they be completely removed from negotiations. If a development agreement were being negotiated with someone and the board wanted to keep these in the mix, you know, that's perfectly acceptable. It's your decision for that. But we really feel that it needs more in-depth negotiations because we're not sure of what the fiscal impacts would be.
Okay. Supervisor Pinches.
First, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3 of 13, it says, talking about the county finds and determines,